Okay, so welcome to the review. We are looking at the time period 1750 to 1900. I believe this is the last review. We've done all the other ones, so let's go ahead and break this down. I want us to look at the big picture first. It's important to do this because this is how you see how essays are made, how essay prompts come together. So one thing we have here is we have the second wave of imperialism. All right, second great wave of imperialism. The first wave was in 1450 to 1750, and in that time period you had Columbus making his way over to the Americas, and the imperialism over there was about silver, it was about cash crops like sugar, and to spread Catholicism and so forth. And then this period begins with the independence of all those areas, so those areas get their independence and kind of ends that, but then there's a new second great wave of imperialism. And this one is based on the needs of industrial nations. And it breaks into areas that were able to resist the first wave. China, South Asia, most of Africa could resist that first wave of imperialism, but they cave in in this time period. So that's kind of the big thing. This is also the age of revolutions, political revolutions, independence revolutions, and of course economic revolutions, and that is the Industrial Revolution, which is a big deal. So I'm just going to go through units 5 and 6 and cover these things, and you can really go down through the 5.1 to 5.8 in these and just kind of use that as a good review. They don't have to be meshed together as much as, for example, Unit 1 and Unit 2 had to be meshed together. And we can just look at this the way it is. So the first topic, and this is the hard one to actually timeline, because so many things are interwoven. The Industrial Revolution is going on at the same time as imperialism, so they all kind of interact. But what you have right here at the beginning is the age of Enlightenment, and this is, of course, new ideas about two things relevant to us here in AP World History, new ideas about what makes politics legitimate and the way individuals should be viewed. Individuals before this, their worth was based on what group they belonged to. And that determined at birth the amount of rights that you had, the privileges that you had, and what your station, so to speak, in life was going to be. The Enlightenment advocated the idea that every individual is a self-made man or woman, that they're born with natural rights. And they can, those rights are life and liberty, and anyone should be able to own property. Of course, that runs against the old aristocratic idea. What makes politics legitimate? This is a very big deal with the Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke and Rousseau. And they made the argument that a government should have the consent of its people. And they bound together in a contractual style of a relationship. That means it could be broken by either side. So it wasn't a top-down, God gave this king the right to rule, and so now you obey the king because you're disobeying God if you disobey the king. Now it's, instead of a kind of a vertical, it's more of a horizontal. We both enter into a relationship, contractual relationship, and the government gets its authority from the people. So that's different, and that's going to lead to all kinds of different things. And by the way, one thing about the Enlightenment that you have here, one part of the beginning of the abolitionist movement. And this abolition means the termination of slavery. So the African slavery that was a big part of the Atlantic system over here in the previous time period, between 1450 and 1750, you had that triangular system of trade in the Atlantic, and the part from Africa to the Americas was almost all the slave trade. You have the idea here that that's wrong, that individuals have rights, and so that led to the abolishment of the slave. That and some religious revivals that took place in England and so forth all culminated to the end of the slave trade. Also, the Enlightenment kind of, you begin to see the beginning of, I wouldn't call it the feminist movement yet, but women becoming more conscious of things, pushing for education, starting to push for the right to suffrage, which means the right to vote. But if you get a question on the AP test about this, don't forget that the right to vote for women doesn't really take place until the next century, the next time period. It's right after World War I. Most Western countries, including the United States, give women the right to vote. So this Enlightenment brings kind of these new ideas about society and slavery, and the beginning of women's rights is part of that. Now, revolutions, you have political revolutions. The first one is 1776, and that's right here, that creates the United States. And I just want to say, I'm not going to review all the revolutions, but you should know they come in two basic categories. Those that simply want to break away from a colonial power. This is the 13 colonies here. This is Mexico. This is Gran Colombia, South America's colony. This is Brazil. They simply want a clean cut from the control that is being placed on them from across the ocean. So they don't want the kings to have control anymore. They want to send the peninsulares back home, or the viceroys back home. These are independence movements. They are led by the Creoles, the descendants of the first people who came over from those countries. So in Spain, or in Latin America, that's mainly Spanish people. In Brazil, it's Portuguese, and here in the 13 colonies, it is the white British settlers. So they're the ones who want independence. They do not want a total change of the social structure, right? They're not going to free slaves. They're not going to welcome indigenous people. So you have that to bear in mind. The other model is a true revolution where it aims to completely change the structure of everything, and France is a good example of that. The French Revolution was not about breaking away from a foreign king. It was about doing away with the idea of kings that have divine right. And so you have the French Revolution. And the French Revolution just laid waste to the old feudal system, where your livelihood was determined by what class you were born in. So it did end that. Now, it led to problems. It led to Napoleon and brought France into about a decade of war, but that was the basics of the French Revolution. And then you got the Haitian Revolution, which is both of those combined in the Caribbean. Haiti wanted independence, but it also wanted a transformation, and it was led by the slaves. You should know some people involved in these in case you have to write about them. Simon Bolivar, I think you all can name Thomas Jefferson in Washington, and Toussaint Louverture is the guy in Haiti. Another very important thing that comes out of this is the concept of nationalism. Really, you can't understand the 20th century, you can't understand the decline of empire, which has been the most popular, most common form of government in all of history, has been empires. There aren't any today. Now we have these things called nations. And a nation is a group of people that feel like they have something in common, and they want their own state to rule them. And of course, that's going to put pressure on all empires, because empires are by definition diverse. They're made up of pockets of conquered people that have their own identity. Think of the Ottoman Empire after Constantinople fell in the previous time period. They controlled what was part of the Byzantines, where they controlled Greece. Well, as nationalism, which is spread by Napoleon after the revolution, as nationalism intensified, Greeks who were Orthodox Christian, who have this incredible, proud history of philosophy and science, and going back to great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, they wanted to rule themselves. And there was an independence movement away from the Ottoman Empire in this time period that created this new thing called the nation of Greece. The nation of France came out of this. So nationalism is a new idea in world history that was born out of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. And it's very important for understanding the pressure placed on empires, because all these pockets of different ethnicities want to break apart. Remember, that led to the assassination that started World War I. It was nationalism. Okay, the Industrial Revolution is the next thing that we're going to deal with here. And this is really something that was going on in England, right? It was going on in England already in its early form. And you need to know some basics about its progress. It starts in England. It becomes a Western European thing. It was a little bit delayed in the United States because of the Civil War, but eventually picks up in the Civil War. Other nations will try to have a go at it. Some were more successful than others. But the Industrial Revolution will go across here, and then you'll get to something called the Second Industrial Revolution. Can't spell today. Now, I may have mentioned this in a different context, but if you're writing an essay on the AP test and you're repeating the same phrase over and over again, like Industrial Revolution or Green Revolution, once you've said it once or written it once, you can just capital I, capital R, and it won't count against you. And that might be something good to know if you're tight on time, all right? In the old days when we used to teach the whole course, going back to, the River Valley civilizations, imagine an essay on the Indus River Valley civilization. Writing that every time you mention it, you could just put IRVA or VC, and just keep that in mind when you're writing essays. So what's the second industrial revolution? The second industrial revolution is a higher tech form. It focused on electricity, motors, telegraphs, advances in chemistry, which led to fertilizers and higher, more complex medicines that's going to help people live longer. So that's what you have here, the second industrial revolution, it's the same idea, it just becomes more high tech. This is like factories to weave cotton, or railroads. Now you're getting to electrical things and more, chemistry and medicine and those types of things. All right. This industrial revolution did eventually spread to Japan. They successfully industrialized. Russia industrialized to some extent. And that falls under one of the topics called the government's role in industrialization. Britain basically had a government that was favorable to industrialization but stayed out of the game. They believed in pure laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire is the French word that means let it alone. The government just stands away and lets business, on social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, let it go. Japan actually, it was the government in Japan that brought industrialization. That was something called part of the Meiji Restoration, you might remember. And in Russia, the government, realizing they were behind, this is kind of an ongoing story with Russia, decided to force industrialization. That's why they freed the serfs to become laborers. They didn't have a workforce and nobody was migrating there. So they freed the serfs to be factory workers, and that was the Sergei Witt led that, the Witt system. It focused on Trans-Siberian railroads and got some things done, but that was never really totally successful. Stalin will do that, the 5-year plan between World War I and World War II. Okay, economic developments in this time period, you need to know a couple of ideologies. I think there are only 2 people you have to know by name in this time period, and they're Adam Smith and Karl Marx. All right, Adam Smith, these are opposing ideologies. As a matter of fact, you might say that the ideologies of Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, and Karl Marx, the father of communism, really framed the Cold War after World War II, because that's what it is. It's rival ideologies. Capitalism is the belief that every individual has the right to private ownership and to keep all the wealth that they create. Okay? Private ownership of the means of production. In its most basic essence, socialism and communism believed that the means of production shouldn't be owned by people other than those who actually work those tools. So they should be collectively owned. So if you guys all work in a factory, you're running machines that I own. I'm benefiting from it because your labor is creating all this wealth and I just give you a salary, which is nothing compared to what you're actually making. Socialism is to get that private owner out of there and you guys, the workers, own these things collectively. Communism is a little bit stricter form. Socialism, there can be a soft socialism, there can be a harsh socialism, but it's basically private ownership of anything that creates wealth should be abolished. It should be owned collectively. Communism, Karl Marx also believed that all of history is the story of class tensions between the haves and the have-nots. All right, it's the landlords and the serfs, it's the factory owners and the proletariat, or the factory workers. And he believed that all this would end with a communist revolution where the factory workers took over the factories and all the exploitation that existed in the world would finally end, and he was all, touchy-feely about it's going to bring this golden age of equality, and it didn't happen. So these are the two ideas that you should know: Marxism and Marxism and capitalism. Also, in this age, you had the rise of transnational companies. They're the forerunner to multinational corporations that we looked at after World War II. United Fruit is a good example. It's a U.S. company that has kind of work all over the world, and the United Fruit lobbied Latin American governments, or bribed Latin American governments, to give them very cheap access to land where a lot of fruit was grown in Honduras and Guatemala and so forth, and got it for almost no property taxes whatsoever. And so you had that would lead to problems in the 20th century. But anyway, transnational companies grow out of this time period. Reactions to the industrial economy, well, you have labor unions form, and remember, the workers were kind of exploited. People moving from agricultural areas into cities. The cities were jam-packed. There was no infrastructure. They lived in raw sewage. It was just tons of people crammed into these little apartment buildings called tenement housings. And Marx thought that there's going to be a revolution, that these people will revolt against the capitalists. So that one aspect, or one response, was the rise of socialism or communism. One that actually came to fruition was the rise of labor unions, where people grouped together and threatened to go on strike if they didn't get what they wanted, better conditions. But if you remember, the thing that gave the workers the biggest changes in their life, which saved capitalism, was they got the right to vote. All right? Poor people, doesn't matter what race, what gender, poor people could not vote. Okay? Only wealthy people could vote in England, France, and even in the United States. That was done away with in the first half of the 19th century. It was 1828 in the United States, the first election where any male could vote, any white male could vote, but it used to be only the rich ones. So governments are only responsive in a democracy to people who can vote. They don't care about people who can't vote. You don't need to do anything for them to get reelected. But as soon as poor people can vote, and they outnumbered the wealthy, as soon as poor people could vote, which means factory workers, politicians knew to stay in office, we need to do things for them. And now you have minimum wage, you have caps on the amount of hours you can work in a week. In some countries, like in Germany, they brought health care to the people, they brought a retirement to people, and the life of the worker got better, and then they didn't revolt. So kind of democracy kind of saved capitalism from ever having to go through the radical communist revolutions that Marx thought that they would go through. Now we need to talk about 5.5. I just want to mention this quickly. It talks about the technology of the industrial age. Look, just know, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is all about the steam engine, okay? The steam engine. This is why Britain was poised so perfectly to be the first nation. They had large deposits of coal. They had canals and rivers, which were great before trains were built. They had all the perfect ingredients. And by the way, they're listed there in 5.3 on the topic page, the things that nations really need to have in order before they can industrialize. Britain just had them. But you should equate the steam engine with the beginning of industrialization and then more technical things during the second industrial revolution. Okay, a very important topic is society in the industrial age. And I could see, you may have written an LEQ in here, I forget. How did the Industrial Revolution affect society? This is something that you should know. It changed social structure somewhat. First of all, most obviously, it created a brand new class of people that could not have existed before this. And that is the working class of factory workers. In Marxism, they're called the Proletariat. So it created a new class of factory workers. It made the middle class, who invested in factories and invested in joint stock companies and corporations, it made them more important. And their life, the middle class, their life went way up. It got much better. The class that became irrelevant was the aristocrats. Really, they held everything together in feudalism. They owned the manors. They provided protection for the serfs who worked. That day, that system was gone. People are working in factories now, but they still had all the rights. They still owned the property. And by the way, the French Revolution was an attempt to fix that, to update society based on how society had changed, how economics had changed. So you have an aristocratic class that's no longer relevant anymore. They still have some wealth, but they're just not that important. They're not an engine of economics any longer. You have middle class women. Their lives increase. They get somewhat more rights. They usually run the affairs of the home, and this is kind of unique. Middle class men, we talked about this, the cult of domesticity, is that I'm a middle class businessman. My wife does not work. And that's a sign that I have arrived. I make enough money so my wife does not have to go out and work. She's not in a factory. She runs the affairs of the home. She takes care of the kids. And she makes all the financial decisions, and she's the moral example for the kids. That's called the cult of domesticity. You might want to drop that in an essay if you have to write about changes. It's strictly middle class, increase in responsibility, and you might say increase in the status of middle class women. You don't really see that among the working class. Women are working in factories right next to men. They're both kind of low. Right? They're equally poor, you might say. Okay, so this is the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution is very important because, as I mentioned before, it leads to the second great wave of imperialism, okay? And this wave of imperialism, I can't really just pinpoint it. It just kind of, it goes with Industrial Revolution because industrial economies need markets to sell to. They need massive amounts of raw materials, as you know. So, let's just go through Unit 6. The first topic is called Rationales for Imperialism. The rationale for imperialism was to get, first of all, to get raw materials and to secure markets to sell your goods into, but then you also had this thing called social Darwinism. That's very important. Social Darwinism, and by the way, somebody wrote in an essay, not in here, but an essay that covered 1450 to 1750 that social Darwinism did something. You can't have social Darwinism before Darwin. Darwin published in 1858, I think, his Origin of Species. And those ideas made their way into the understanding of economics. And hence you have social Darwinism. It's the idea that justifies strength over weakness. And so if you're doing good for someone, it's okay to take them over. Out of social Darwinism, you have this idea, and it's stated in this topic, of this thing called a civilizing mission. And I think a lot of you saw the movie, the little clip I showed on the Belgians in Congo. The historian said, you're improving them, you're civilizing them. Even if you're shooting them and beating them, you're civilizing them. Because social Darwinism made its way into how people understood race, unfortunately. And they thought some races were higher evolved, and you're actually helping them evolve by bringing them up to our civilization. That was a huge justification in the minds of people who were taking over Africa and Asia during this time period. So you should know that. There was state expansion. Some states grew. That means they became more imperial. Some empires shrunk or contracted. The U.S. grew. We went to war with Spain. We took over Cuba. All right, we took their colonies in the Philippines, and the U.S. took some other islands in the Pacific. Japan became imperial and extended its empire, moved into the northern part of China and Manchuria. So Japan expanded. Russia expanded. Who did not expand? What empire shrunk? Spain and Portugal. And that has to do with the revolutions here. The Spanish Empire, well, when the U.S. went to war against Spain to take Cuba, obviously the Spanish Empire shrunk. That was pretty much the end of the Spanish Empire when the U.S. took Cuba, because they had already lost everything to independence movements here when Mexico and Gran Colombia and everything else became independent. There's another topic called indigenous responses to imperialism. How did the indigenous people respond to this? And you have all kinds of examples and the illustrative examples of this on the topic page, but remember, you should just be able to explain one of them really well. And I think the one that we dealt with in class was in South Asia. How did the South Asians deal with imperialism of the British? They did something called the Sepoy Rebellion. Sepoy Rebellion, I believe, was 1857 to 1858. So right in the middle, kind of right here, the Sepoy Rebellion. And remember, that was provoked because the British just didn't care about the culture of the South Asians, making them use pig fat and cow fat to lubricate their guns. And the Hindus and Muslims that made up the Sepoys revolted. So that was the response to this. I made a video just about a couple of these topics here, and there's another one called the cattle killing movement in southern Africa, where the Africans went on a killing spurge of their own cattle, believing they had received a message from a god that this is the only way to get rid of the British. That's called a millenarian movement. The end of the world's going to come if we don't do something drastic. And it basically, they starved to death because the cows were their primary source of food. That's called the Aksha, it's Xosa, cattle killing movement. I have a video about it, and it's also in the illustrative examples. So those are indigenous responses to state expansion. By the way, another indigenous response, if you look at the colonies in the Americas, was slaves escaped. We talked about this in the previous time period, formed maroon societies. That's a way of responding against imperialism. That's how they responded to forced slavery. They escaped and formed these maroon societies in the northern part of South America. All right. 6.4 says global economic development. Global economic development. Look, this is, I'm calling out the names of these because that's how essay prompts are made, and I want to make sure you know that you know the content to fill that in. If you have to write about global economic development between 1750 and 1900, just think about how any empire grew and began globally to use places around the world. Think about Britain using India to grow opium and then selling it where? In China. Okay? Think about the entire Great Scramble for Africa. After the Berlin Conference, and the Berlin Conference was 1885, I believe, right over here. The Berlin Conference led to the Great Scramble. And some examples that are given on that topic page are things like rubber. That was from the Congo. Think about Belgium exploiting the people there. Remember, they cut off the hands of the kids if their parents could not reach quotas. You saw some of those terrible videos. That is global economic development. So know some examples of that. China and India, two areas that resisted imperialism in the previous time, fell in after the Sepoy Rebellion. They get sucked into the British Empire, and then after the Opium Wars, China kind of collapses and countries come in and get their spheres of influence. These are all examples of that global economic development. Okay. 6.8, I pretty much cover that. Economic imperialism means imperialism that's meant to take over areas for economic reasons. Remember, there's also a type of colonization that's called, a type of colony called a settler colony. You should know examples of a settler colony. Algeria is the one that I dealt with in the podcast. That was a French colony in North Africa. In a sense, the U.S. was 13 colonies that made the U.S. In a sense, back there were settler colonies because people came here to live for the most part. All right? And settler colonies become problematic in independence, as you'll see, as you saw in 1900 to the present with Algeria's bloody independence movement. Okay, that brings us to migration and the effects of migrations in this time period. So let's take a look at this last topic. Migrations is a favorite world history topic because it's so world history-ish. It deals with the movement of people and culture, and it deals with global issues. So you had migration back here in the previous time period, and it was basically the triangular system. That movement of 9 million people from Africa against their will to the Americas was a forced migration. Migrations here follow the patterns of industrialization. All right, so let's just do a quick change over time, look at migrations. In the previous time period, think of slaves or enslaved Africans being taken from Africa to the Americas, to the tune of about 9 to 11 million of them. In this time period, it's migrations that dealt usually with industrial labor. Rural to urban in Europe, international coming to the United States. That means coming from Ireland, coming from Russia, coming from Germany, and coming from China to build railroads in the United States. All right? In the next period, 1900 to the present, a hallmark of migration there is colonies that get independence. You have people migrating to the big cities of the countries that used to control them. People from South Asia, India and Pakistan going to London. People from Algeria, North Africa, former French colonies going to Paris. So here's just kind of a quick shot of the different patterns of migrations that you see from really 1450 all the way up to the last time period. So to focus a little bit more here, we talked about industrial migrations already. There's another migration I want to mention. It has to do with the end of the slave trade. Slavery is going to end. I think Brazil might be the last place to end slaves in 1888, I believe. In the United States, the Civil War. Emancipation, I think, was 1862, but it didn't mean anything until the North won. And in 1861, Russia freed its serfs. So you have slavery is ending all over the world in this time period. But that doesn't mean that sugar still isn't valuable. What took the place of slaves? Coming from Africa to work sugar, you had the rise of indentured servants, or something called indentured servitude. This is where people are kind of recruited. Like, British would go to India and say, hey, anyone need to work? We will pay your way for you to move to the Caribbean, and you work for 10 years. That was the indenture. An indenture was a contract. And after 10 years, you will have paid back your indenture. You'll have made money, and you're free to get out of the indenture. So this changed the focus of migration. It's no longer enslaved Africans going over to the Americas. Indentured servants are coming from South Asia and East Asia. They're going from Japan to Hawaii to harvest pineapples. Indentured servants are going from, as I mentioned, South Asia to South America and the Caribbean, and you still see remnants of that today. You'll find groups of South Asians living in the northern part of South America, and Hindu temples there. It's the result of this change in migrations. The effects of migrations, a lot of people who came over kind of stuck together because they felt comfort in their own culture. So you have most big cities that welcomed immigrants. And to this country, in the late 19th century, most of the immigrants came through Ellis Island, where you have the Statue of Liberty, and the main train from that station went straight into Manhattan. So you got all these people coming into Ellis Island. They went into Manhattan. A lot of them did, and you have them finding other people who know their language, who came from their country too. And this is the formation of places like Little Italy in New York, Chinatown in New York. San Francisco had a Chinatown. Miami had a Little Cuba, where people from Cuba stuck together. Tampa had a Little Cuba. All right. So these are called cultural enclaves. A little group, or sometimes a large group of people of a similar culture living together, and they just duplicate their culture in this area. Chinatown feels so much like China. All right. And one negative aspect of this is oftentimes immigrants were the target of systematic discrimination by governments. I would know at least one example. I'm going to give you two, and then we'll close it off today. One is the U.S. government in the 19th century passed the Chinese Exclusionary Act, and that did exactly what it said. The U.S. got to a point where they forbade any immigrants coming from China. There was a lot of fear about Chinese culture, and it was when Irish came over, a lot of Protestants were like, oh, too many Catholics coming over. But Catholics and Protestants, despite their differences, they're still both Christian. When Buddhists, Confucianists came over, people didn't know what to do. So they were getting fearful about this. And also they were fearful if unemployment is rising among white people, too many people from China here. So they pressured Congress, and Congress just cut immigration from China in this time period. And Chinese culture had a huge impact on the coast of California, for example, some of those cities there. So there's one example of a government actually instituting a discriminatory policy against immigrants. And the other one, and this is the worst sounding one, this comes out of Australia, and it's just what it sounds like. It's called their white policy, where Australia just said, you can migrate here if you're white. They would not take any person of color. So you could go from Europe to Australia, you could go from Ireland, you could go from England, you could go to France, but you could not come from India, you could not come from Southeast Asia, you could not come from Africa. They simply cut anyone from migrating to Australia who was not white. That was the basis of the Australian white policy. Doesn't really sound good. It sounds terrible given our sensitivities to this type of thing today. It was a bad thing. So there is the framework of 1750 to 1900. Notice how there's a recycling of that whole colonization, imperialism, independence, new colonization based on industrial nations. Now that independence doesn't take place till after World War I in the great decolonization during the Cold War. But it is a repeat. Look at the changes in labor. Look at the changes in society, and it's almost all based on industrialization. And look how the new imperialism is different from the old. This is fueled by social Darwinism. It takes areas that could resist in the previous time period and new patterns of migration. So these are the big picture things to look at. All right. Thanks.